As the old saying goes, beauty is only skin deep. Many agree with this, but there are a few that are willing to buck the trend and say, nay, I disagree with this, and I'm going to prove it wrong. I'm going to take this and I'm going to cut deep, right to the very bone. Ugh, squelchy. Grafted is a Shudder original from New Zealand. It was written and directed by Sasha Rainbow, as well as written by Lee Murray, Mia Marmar, as well as Hualin Ao. I hope I pronounced that name correctly. Check out their IMDb pages for the full listens of their work. And this centers around a young lady named Wei, who basically, after her father ends up in a not so good position, shall we say, in the very beginning of the movie. I'll talk about that in the spoilers. We jettison over to New Zealand, Auckland, New Zealand, as it were, where, well, Wei has to go away for a bit. Har, 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 har. If you think that's the only Wei joke I'm going to make, you don't know me very well. She lives with her auntie, as well as another family member named Angela, who really doesn't want her to be there because she thinks Wei is a little bit weird, because weird has Wei in it, just with an RD at the end. Speaking of RDs, they have a lot of roads there in New Zealand. Don't really know why I decided to say that, and Wei just wants to fit in. Oh yes, and Wei also has a birthmark that's going to factor into some plot developments a little bit later on. But she really just wants Angela to accept her, but Angela's just a raging goddamn bitch. By the way, Angela is played by Jess Hong, who has been in some stuff, actually does, has a familiar face for those that recognize some New Zealand films. And, well, Wei can't really fit in at school. There is a science teacher named Paul, who is not Paul anymore. He is Super Paul. Actually, he's played by Jared Turner, who is really just trying to find the next big thing, because he was an up-and-coming scientist that really seemed like he was ascending to superstardom, but certain things have basically stunted that, and he's also a bit of a mad scientist, and sees Wei's work, that she's carrying on her dad's work, which should give you an idea of what happened to her dad, and decides, hey, this could be my ticket out of this college. Oh yes, and there's also various students in this, and also goopy, glitzy, and gloppy body horror elements. They kind of seem straight out of the 1980s, 1970s even, with a bit of throwback synth music, as well as just, an overall feel of horror and comedy, and some stuff that we maybe have seen in other projects, but never with not really a lot of great execution in this. I really tried to like Grafted. I really tried to like it. There were parts that I did like. I actually liked the opening of the movie, and I liked the setup, and thought, okay, even as it gets a little more bonkers, that should be okay. I don't mind bonkers horror. I don't mind ridiculous horror. Unfortunately, this movie doesn't feel like any of its bonkers moments are earned, and there are so many parts to this where I'm like, okay, that really doesn't fucking work. Why are these characters just suddenly being so monumentally stupid? Why are they even being dumber than normal? And yeah, taking the movie as straight entertainment, unfortunately, none of it is earned. And you don't feel for any of the characters that get comeuppance, shall we say. You really don't feel for Wei one way or another. Har har. And there's a particular lack of weight to these, particular stakes. It doesn't, none of it really gels. As much as they have a nice setup, it gets bonkers, but just not with a lot to sink your teeth into. Ironic for a goopy, gloppy, fleshy, skin graftingly horror, theme that this movie has. It has a couple decent moments, and the cast does the best they can, and there's an earnest effort to make this, familiar territory and the idea of beauty standards, weighing us down and everything, when everybody should be able to accept any, imperfections, because nobody's perfect, by the way. There's nothing wrong with birthmarks, beauty marks, marks on your body or whatever, except who you are. You're still beautiful. There you go. But this doesn't dive enough into that. It's not like The Substance. It's not like, it's not like Influencer. It's not like a lot of other Shudder originals that have neat little ideas. This just ends up stumbling and then just totally loses me, falls off a goddamn cliff into a ravine, and lands on a broken down ice cream truck, which those who have seen the movie will get it. There is a barking dog in this, a little dog. The dog ends up fine, by the way, so I really can't fault the movie for that. Joanna Sun does fine as Wei, but yeah, you really can't take a wait and see approach here. Har har. You just have to accept the movie as it is, but unfortunately, none of it's earned. Just none of this actually fully connects. And as it tries to go more, crazy and everything, you're just like, okay, now it's just doing stuff because they're out of ideas and spinning its wheels, and it's just caught because, I don't know, there's a goddamn kiwi bird, trying to basically, essentially, I don't know, peck the logic out of the goddamn movie. I know I actually think that's what kiwi birds do. I do want to actually bring a guest on here who is not a kiwi bird, but I want to bring a guest on here because there is something that somebody wants to say. You were curious why I was watching this movie. This is served by The Way, Adopt Don't Shop. And you were curious why in the world some of these monker moments are happening. And I was explaining to you is because, unfortunately, when you have 4 writers, you have a bunch of ideas, and then you have a bunch of stuff that doesn't really end up working all that well, and then you have stuff that just doesn't gel, and even the stuff that should have, it just really doesn't work, right? It just doesn't. The thing about the movie is while it does try to, set things up nicely, it just ends up stumbling. And for the 93 minutes that this movie runs, I'm sorry, it did not work. It really didn't. I appreciate the effort, but nevertheless, I am going to get into spoilers, and you're going to get into the spoilers with me. So yeah, that's it. 3, 2, 1, spoilers. So it is on Shudder, and basically the father is experimenting with, genetic material as a way to essentially, fix his beauty mark or his birthmark on his cheek and fix her birthmark. He tries to fix his own. Unfortunately, there's an element that he forgot, and he ends up basically shutting his mouth, and he can't cut it open. Actually, that was a nice little body horror moment. And then his daughter, his young Wei, is trying to find an airway and basically ends up killing him. Yeah, how about you don't do that to me if I ever do any genetic experiments? How about that? So, basically, yeah. So, I told you how Angela was treating her, and that didn't really, jive with me, because it's like, Wei just wants to be accepted, but there's no way that's going to happen. Unfortunately, despite a little bit of decent setup, the aunt just kind of leaves. She's like not really ever there. And Angela and a couple friends end up kind of playing a cruel prank on Wei, which doesn't end up going their way, shall we say. And also the teacher is banging this one student called Eve. Again, there are characters in this that actually could have, lent a little something to, okay, goofy comedy horror, and it's like, no, these characters we're just taking elements from other horror movies, and she basically ends up killing everybody. She first kills Angela when Angela attacks her. She ends up stabbing her in the eye, and then she has this brilliant idea to just cut her goddamn face off and graft her face onto her own, because why not? She tries to live as her, study up on what she's doing, and that doesn't really end up working all that well. And also the genetic experimenting doesn't really end up holding because there's a certain element. There's something called, there's basically this flower, this corpse flower that ends up showing up in a rare exhibit. She uses elements for that basically can help with the facial reconstruction, but it doesn't end up really holding. Also, Paul decides to basically pull the work and take it for his own. And that doesn't end up jiving with Wei's ideas to find the proper way to get this scientific knowledge out to the masses. Actually, she just wants to carry on her father's work and do some crazy things, doesn't she? Okay, fine. Basically, the idea here is that the movie itself has a decent little setup, in all seriousness, despite the fact I had the producer there. There is a character named John that is deformed that factors into his finish a little bit later on. There is a lady that is like a gardener. None of these characters are fully fleshed out. Ironic for the skin grafting stuff. I hate to say it, but the gore scenes really feel that earned. So she ends up basically taking some of the corpse flower stuff. Paul is also in a race to try and do this stuff, and it was around the point where she took Angela's face, which probably should have been the point the movie kicked into gear, and it just stumbled and just lost me. It just absolutely lost me. Because she somehow was able to hide the body away from all this. And see, they tried to ground it in a little bit of reality, but then they went this route, and it was totally inconsistent. So Paul stole her dad's notebook, and he's also sleeping with Eve. She ends up killing Eve at one point. Well, Eden, actually. Eden, Miss Eden, I'll just call her, basically. And she tries to hide in this weird pool thing, but she ends up getting a drill through her head. Which, again, all these sound a lot more interesting than they actually end up being an execution. And yeah, it's paralyzingly dull. It just is. Like, it just gets more illogical, and not in a fun way. Just in a, okay, you are just out of ideas movie. You're just absolutely out of ideas. The dog keeps barking again. The dog is fine. She basically has to keep doing the facial grafting and takes Eve's face and realizes that Paul has basically perfected the formula, steals the vial, which is a way to basically fix all this stuff and I guess give her a new way of life. She's talking to John like once or twice, I think 2 times at this point, by the way. Once when she first arrives in New Zealand, and then another time when she, when she's getting a little bit better, a little more confident. And Jasmine, by the way, I do have to shout, Sepi Toa, she actually does, well, if anybody from this movie happens to be watching, I'm very sorry if I mispronounce the names. She, throughout this, is actually trying to befriend. I think genuinely trying to befriend Wei. But Wei is totally off the, off the beaten path and everything. She's way far gone. And because she spots something in the fridge, which turns out actually to be Eve's head, she gets strangled and choked out with saran wrap. Paul shows up because at one point, pretending to be Eve, she steals the vial. And then she ends up basically getting Paul with some kind of deal, I don't really goddamn know, and ends up cutting some flesh off and dancing around and doing all this. And I'm making it sound more interesting than it actually is. Oh yes, and also the gardener lady shows up, sees that and runs off. The police get called. She ends up running with the vial and everything, talks to John, John holds her, but then she spills the vial. And this vial, for some reason, ends up fusing them together, so now they're this unholy super creature. Auntie Liang is upset, or whatever. The aunt is upset, and then spots, Wei walking along the parkway, or the roadway, as it were. But then freaks out when she sees what she actually is. She's this weird fused creature, and she is no longer beautiful. Oh, and the dog's alive. I don't expect a ton of logic, but when you're trying to have a more serious tone, and then you go bonkers, but you can't figure out a way to balance it, there's just something that didn't gel with this. I was actively getting more annoyed as the film went on. That's the unfortunate part of it. There was potential here. I look forward to what else the director can do. And I think the cast can, do even better projects. A couple elements that worked fine, but most of it just didn't. And a lot of it just really annoyed me. So I have to give it an F. I'm sorry. This should have been my jam. It was not. I should look like a lot of blood was jam. But nevertheless, yeah, it gets an F. I'm sorry. Agree, disagree with what I said. Like, share, subscribe. Twitter, Letterboxd, Blue Sky handles in the description. I'm John Rickland. I'll see you soon.